Blood had a sound that night. Not the roar of battle nor the scream of pain, but a soft, steady drip against the sand. Each drop melted into the dirt like the desert was swallowing a secret. The wind carried the smell of smoke and something darker, something human. Jonas Creed knelt beside a dying fire, his shadow stretching long across the basin floor. The air trembled with heat, and the flicker of the flames painted his weather-worn face in streaks of orange and scarlet. He pressed a hand to the stranger's wound, steady, deliberate, almost tender, but the blood kept coming. Her breath hitched, shallow and ragged, a reminder that the desert had no mercy for the weak. Jonas had seen plenty die under skies like this. Men, women, even children, all claimed by dust and time. But this one had clawed her way out of a burning wagon, half dead, half mad, and still fighting to breathe. He didn't even know her name, only that she was young, scarred, and carrying a kind of silence that told him she'd done terrible things to stay alive. Her fingers twitched against his wrist. "You should have left me," she rasped. Jonas kept his eyes on the wound. "Maybe you'll regret this." "I usually do." A faint smirk touched her lips. Not joy, not gratitude, just exhaustion laced with something bitter. The fire popped, spitting sparks into the cold air, and she turned her head slightly toward him. Her lips trembled, cracked and dry. "You saved my life." Jonas leaned closer, voice low and rough from years of dust and whiskey. "Don't talk. You've lost too much blood." But she didn't stop. Her eyes, wide, glassy, fever-bright, locked on his. And then, with a whisper that barely existed, she said, "Then take it if you want it." Jonas froze. The flames flickered between them, shadows dancing across her face. He didn't understand what she meant. Not yet. But something in her voice lingered, like a thorn buried under the skin. He looked down at his hands, blood on the palms, guilt on the knuckles, and for the first time in years he felt that old familiar chill, the one that whispered, "You can't save anyone out here, not even yourself." The wind rose, carrying away the scent of smoke and death. Jonas glanced toward the horizon. Nothing but emptiness. Tomorrow he'd try to move her. But tonight, in that small circle of firelight, the past had found him again, and the desert was listening. The sun broke over the basin like a blade of fire, slicing through the lingering mist of dawn. The world smelled of scorched wood and rainless dust. Jonas Creed adjusted the saddle straps with rough, practiced hands, his eyes drawn to the woman slumped against a rock nearby. Her face was ghost-pale beneath the crust of soot. She hadn't stirred since midnight, but the shallow rise and fall of her chest meant she was still clinging to the edge of this world. He couldn't decide if that was mercy or punishment. He crouched beside her. "You can sit a saddle?" he asked quietly. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of worn copper, bright even through exhaustion. "If I can't," she whispered, "you can drag me." Jonas almost smiled. "Almost. You've got fire, I'll give you that." She tilted her head slightly. Her lips cracked into something that wasn't quite a smile. "And you've got more mercy than most men I've met out here." He said nothing, just slipped an arm under her shoulders and lifted her onto his horse. She winced but didn't cry out. The moment his hands left her, she swayed in the saddle, gripping the horn with trembling fingers. "Hold on," he murmured, mounting up behind her. Creed ranch ain't close. They started east, the direction of sunrise, where the desert rolled in endless amber waves. The land was empty, silent, save for the rhythmic creak of leather and the hollow thud of hooves. The horizon shimmered with heat, and mirages danced like ghosts. As the hours stretched on, she spoke, fragments between breaths. "The wagon, it wasn't an accident." Jonas kept his eyes ahead. "I figured as much. There were men masked. They wanted something. Didn't care who they burned for it. What were they after?" Her silence said more than words ever could. A hawk circled overhead, its cry cutting through the dry air. Jonas's gaze followed it for a long moment before settling back on the trail. "Name's Creed," he said finally. She turned her head slightly. "I know." He frowned. "You've heard it?" Her voice lowered, almost ashamed. "Everyone's heard of the Creeds." He waited for her to explain. She didn't. By midday, the sky had turned white hot. The mare's breathing grew labored, but Jonas didn't stop. Not until they reached the ridge overlooking a valley of faded grass and a cluster of old wooden buildings. The only green patch for miles. There, he said. Home. It wasn't much. A weathered cabin, a leaning barn, a corral half swallowed by weeds. But it stood, stubborn, scarred like its owner. He helped her down, his hands steady beneath her weight. For a second their eyes met, an unspoken exchange neither of them could name. Then he carried her inside. The cabin smelled of cedar and smoke. Jonas laid her gently on the cot beside the hearth, where light filtered through cracked shutters. He poured water into a tin cup, held it to her lips. Drink slow. She obeyed, the tremor in her hand betraying how close she was to collapsing. After a moment, she whispered, "You risked your life for someone you don't even know." Jonas's eyes flickered toward the window, to the long stretch of nothing beyond. "Lady, out here we're all strangers till the end." She let out a weak laugh. "You're not much of a talker, are you?" "No," he said. "Talking's what gets folks killed." The fire popped in the hearth. Outside, the wind shifted, low and restless, carrying the scent of the storm rolling over far ridge. Jonas stood, setting the cup aside. "You can rest here tonight. After that, you move on." Her eyes lifted to him, cautious, searching. "And if I can't?" He met her stare without flinching. "Then you better start praying you can." She smiled faintly, like a woman used to threats. "You don't scare easy, Mr. Creed." He turned toward the door, hand brushing the revolver at his hip. "Neither do you." The door creaked open. Wind swept in, scattering ash from the hearth. For a moment he paused, a shadow framed in the doorway. Then he stepped out into the burning afternoon, leaving her to the silence. The desert stretched before him, endless and cruel. And though he didn't know it yet, the past he'd buried deep beneath that same sand was already stirring, clawing its way back to the surface. The basin slept under a pale half-moon, its wind whispering through sagebrush and old bones. The night was a silver veil stretched across the desert, broken only by the restless creak of wood and the cry of a lone coyote far out beyond the ridge. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low. Clara lay half awake on the cot, her bandaged arm pressed close to her chest. She could hear Jonas outside, the scrape of boots against gravel, the low murmur of a man talking to himself. He'd been pacing since sundown. Jonas Creed never did well with silence. It reminded him of after battlefields, the way quiet made the dead feel close. He stood by the fence, lantern light casting a small pool of gold in the dark. His mare shifted beside him, uneasy. The cattle hadn't settled either. Every few minutes, they'd grunt and shuffle, as if something unseen brushed past the edge of the herd. Jonas lifted the lantern, scanning the slope. Just wind, just night, but his gut said otherwise. Inside the cabin, Clara's voice came soft through the door. "Can't sleep?" Jonas turned, startled. She stood in the doorway, pale and barefoot, wrapped in a wool blanket that dragged in the dust. The flicker of the lantern caught the red in her hair. Not bright, but enough to remind him of blood. "Shouldn't be up," he said gruffly. "Could say the same to you." He grunted, then nodded toward the open plain. "You ever notice how quiet it gets right before trouble shows its face?" Clara stepped closer, peering into the night. "I stopped noticing quiet a long time ago." He looked at her for a long moment, studying the faint scars that cut through the soot on her skin. They weren't the kind you got from accidents. They were old, deliberate, earned. "You ran from something," he said finally. "Something bad." She met his gaze, her eyes steady. "Didn't we all?" The wind shifted again, colder now. Jonas caught the faintest smell of tobacco on the air, carried from the ridge above the ranch. He set the lantern down, hand drifting toward his holster. "Get inside," he said quietly. Clara froze. "What is it?" "Someone's out there." From the dark, a horse whinnied. Close. Too close. Jonas's jaw tightened. He doused the lantern with a flick of his wrist. Darkness swallowed them whole. "Stay low," he whispered. Through the gloom, they heard muffled voices, two, maybe 3 men, moving along the fence line. The creak of leather, the soft jingle of spurs. Jonas crouched beside the window, pulling his rifle from its rest. He glanced at Clara. "You recognize that sound?" Her expression changed, fear sharp and sudden. "Yes." He didn't have time to ask more. The first shadow crossed the yard, carrying a lantern of its own, a small, swaying light that painted a scarred face in orange and black. Jonas's breath went shallow. "Bounty men. Come out, Creed," one of them called, voice dripping with mockery. "Heard you're nursing a friend of ours. Red-haired woman, mean with a knife?" Jonas's fingers tightened on the rifle. Clara's breath hitched beside him. "Don't shoot," she whispered. "Please." He turned to her, eyes cold. "Why? You know them?" "They're not here for me," she said, voice trembling. "They're here because of me." The man outside laughed. "Don't make us come in, Creed. We just want what's ours." Jonas exhaled slowly, mind working through options he didn't have. "You brought death to my door, lady." Clara's eyes welled with tears. "I never wanted—" "Doesn't matter what you wanted." He stood, kicked the door open, and stepped into the night. The wind tore at his coat, whipping dust across the yard. "Get off my land," he said flatly. The bounty men turned toward the sound. There were 3, silhouettes against the pale moonlight. Their horses shifted uneasily, catching the tension in the air. Now," the leader drawled, his grin showing through the shadows. "Ain't no need for trouble. Hand her over. We'll be gone before sunrise." Jonas raised his rifle. "Ain't handing nobody over." For a heartbeat, the world stood still, the basin holding its breath. Then came the first gunshot. The blast shattered the night. Clara screamed. Jonas dug behind the trough, returning fire. Sparks burst against the stone, and the smell of powder filled the air. When the smoke cleared, 2 of the riders were down. The third, the leader, wheeled his horse around and fled into the basin, his curses echoing off the hills. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. Jonas leaned against the fence post, chest heaving, blood running from a graze across his arm. Clara emerged from the cabin, eyes wide, face pale as ash. She took in the bodies, the smoking barrels, the ruin of what had been a quiet night. "You killed them," she whispered. Jonas looked at her, voice low. They were already dead the second they came here. Clara sank to her knees beside the fallen men. Her hands trembled as she reached for one of the badges glinting in the dirt. The metal was blackened, warped, but the mark was unmistakable. "Marshall's men," she said softly, horror dawning on her face. "Jonas, they weren't bounty hunters. They were law." Jonas froze. The wind cut through the stillness like a knife. Then, faint and far across the basin, came the echo of a horn, 3 sharp blasts, the sound of more riders on the way. He turned toward the horizon, eyes narrowing. Then Law's about to learn the difference between justice and survival. The storm broke over the basin by nightfall. Rain hissed against the roof, running in thin silver lines down warped window panes. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled, throwing restless shadows across the walls. Jonas Creed sat at the edge of the hearth, elbows on his knees, staring into the flames as if they could burn away what he'd done. Outside, the dead men still lay in the mud. 3 marshals, lawmen, not bandits, not thieves, and he'd shot them down like dogs. Jonas's hand trembled as he poured a slug of whiskey into a tin cup. He swallowed it whole, the burn dulling nothing. His revolver sat beside him, slick with rain and guilt. Every time he looked at it, his stomach twisted tighter. Behind him, the floor creaked softly. Clara stood in the doorway, her face ghost pale, her blanket draped loosely over one shoulder. The firelight caught the streaks of soot and the faint red in her hair, painting her in amber and shadow. "You should rest," Jonas muttered. "I can't." Her voice was quiet, almost lost beneath the storm's low growl. She stepped closer, the boards creaking beneath her bare feet. "You haven't said a word since it happened." Jonas didn't look up. "Not much to say. Men are dead." I pulled the trigger. Clara's eyes flicked toward the window, with a faint glimmer of lanterns shown in the distance. "There'll be more by morning," she whispered. "They always send more." He turned then, his gaze sharp. "You gonna tell me why? Why marshals were after you? Why you dragged hell to my doorstep?" She hesitated, her jaw tightening. The silence stretched long enough that he thought she might refuse him again. Then, finally, she exhaled. "They weren't after me," she said softly. "They were after what I took." Jonas leaned forward, the chair creaking. "What did you take? Gold? Horses? What could make lawmen ride across half the territory for one woman?" She shook her head. "Not gold. Not silver." Her eyes glistened in the firelight. "Information." Jonas frowned. "Information?" Clara's voice trembled, but she kept talking. "There's a ledger. Belonged to Judge Mather, the same man who runs most of these counties. It's proof he's been taking bribes, selling land, paying bounty killers to silence ranchers who won't bend to him. I found it by accident. I tried to turn it in, but every sheriff I went to was on his payroll." "So you ran," Jonas said. She nodded. "And they burned the wagon to make it look like I died with the rest of them. But someone must have told them I made it out." Jonas's stare hardened. "So that's what this was. They came to finish the job." Clara lowered her head. "I didn't mean to bring it here. I thought Pine Basin was empty, just a ghost stretch on the map." He studied her for a long moment, eyes unreadable. The fire popped between them, a burst of light catching the tension in her face. "You still got the ledger?" he asked. She hesitated again, then reached under a blanket and pulled a small oilskin bundle from beneath her torn shirt. She set it on the table between them. The leather was scorched at the edges, but intact. Jonas stared at it. "That's enough to hang a man like Mather 10 times over. Or get me killed before dawn," she said quietly. He sat back, jaw tight, the guilt still grinding behind his ribs. He'd killed lawmen, but now he knew the truth. The law had been bought long ago. What he'd done wasn't murder. It was justice, just like every other time he'd been forced to take a stand. Still, the faces of the dead haunted him. He rubbed his temple. The storms were deepening around them. "You could have told me," he said, "before all this." Clara met his gaze. "Would you have believed me?" Jonas didn't answer. He poured another measure of whiskey, then handed her the cup. She took it, her hands trembling. For a long while neither of them spoke. The rain softened, turning to a steady drizzle. The smell of wet earth filled the room. Finally, Clara broke the silence. "You were in the war, weren't you?" Jonas's eyes narrowed. "What makes you think that?" "You talk like a man who's buried more than he's saved." He looked at her then, really looked. There was no judgment in her tone, only a quiet understanding that came from someone who carried her own ghosts. "Yeah," he said at last. "I fought, and I lost." Clara's lips curved into a faint, weary smile. "Then we've got that in common." He almost laughed, but it came out as a sigh. "You're full of bad luck, lady." "I prefer to think I'm full of unfinished stories," she replied softly. Jonas shook his head, but something in his chest loosened. Maybe it was a firelight, maybe the exhaustion, or maybe her courage. The stubborn would have lived when the world had tried to erase her. He stood and walked to the window, watching the rain wash the blood from the yard. "When the storm clears, we'll ride," he said. "There's a man in Dry Creek who still owes me his life. He's got contacts, marshals who ain't bought yet. If we can get that ledger to him, we might have a chance." Clara blinked, hope flickering in her eyes for the first time. "You'd help me?" Jonas didn't turn around. "Ain't helping you," he said quietly. "Just tired of watching good people die for bad men." She smiled faintly, wrapping the blanket tighter. "Then we ride at dawn?" He nodded once. Dawn. Hours later, when the storm had passed, Clara finally slept, curled on the cot beside the dying fire. Her breathing steadied, slow and even, her hand still gripping the corner of the blanket. Jonas sat by the door, rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the horizon where the first hint of morning glowed faintly behind the clouds. The world outside was quiet now, but in that silence he heard it again, the faint hum of guilt and purpose intertwining. He glanced once more at the oilskin ledger on the table. its edges catching the pale firelight. It wasn't just evidence anymore. It was a promise, one that could cost them both everything. Jonas Creed, the man who swore he'd never fight again, found himself whispering under his breath, "All right, Marshal Mather, let's see what the law's really worth." And as the firelight dimmed, the storm gave way to dawn, the kind of dawn that promised blood. The world was still half dark when Jonas Creed saddled the horses. The air was sharp, cool, carrying the clean scent of rain and gunpowder. Every movement was deliberate, tightening the girth, checking the rifle, listening for the faintest sound beyond the fence line. The kind of silence before pursuit. Clara stepped out of the cabin, wrapped in a weathered coat Jonas had found for her. Her hair was still damp from the storm, loose against her face. She looked fragile, but there was a spark in her eyes, the kind that survived fire. "You sure about this?" Jonas asked without looking at her. "No," she said, climbing onto the saddle with slow grace. "But I've been running too long to stop now." He gave a short nod, adjusting his hat. "Then we ride light and fast. Dry Creek's 2 days through open plain. If we're lucky, they won't find the bodies till noon." She gave him a small, wry smile. "You don't seem like a man who counts on luck." "Don't," he said, mounting up beside her. "But sometimes it follows folks who don't deserve it." By sunrise, the basin stretched wide in gold around them. The horses' hooves drummed steady against the packed earth, their breath rising in white plumes that vanished into the warming air. Dust trailed behind them, faint, but enough to mark a path for any who cared to follow. Jonas rode slightly ahead, scanning the ridges. His rifle was tied to the saddle, his revolver loose in its holster. Every sound, every hawk cry, every rustle of grass made his shoulders tense. Behind him, Clara rode in silence, her eyes tracing the endless horizon. The desert seemed to go on forever, harsh, unforgiving, but alive. She'd grown up in the city, where streets were narrow and voices close. Out here, the world was too big to lie. "You were right," she said quietly after a long while. Jonas turned slightly. "About what?" "The quiet. It does come before trouble." He gave a faint smirk. "You're learning fast." By mid-morning, they reached a dry creek bed littered with mesquite and stones bleached white by the sun. Jonas dismounted, crouching low. He pressed a hand to the dirt, still damp from last night's storm. Then he saw it. Hoof prints. Fresh. Deep. "They're tracking us," he muttered. Clara stiffened. "How close?" "Close enough I can smell the tobacco they smoke." He scanned the horizon, nothing but heat and mirage. But the feeling crawled up his spine all the same. He mounted again. "We keep moving. If they catch us in open ground, we're dead before we draw." The wind picked up, whistling through the grass. They pushed harder, the rhythm of the horses quickening. 2 shadows slicing through the vast, empty light. By sundown, they reached a limestone ridge that overlooked the valley to Dry Creek. The settlement was still a day away, hidden behind a rise of canyons and broken trails. Jonas called a halt beneath a stand of twisted pines, where the air smelled of sap and dust. He built a small fire, low, controlled, while Clara gathered her coat tighter. The light flickered across her face, softening the sharp lines left by fear and exhaustion. She broke the silence first. "You ever wonder what it'd be like to stop running?" Jonas didn't answer immediately. He poured her a small cup of coffee, handed it over. "Did once," he said finally. "Didn't work out." She studied him. "You lost someone." He nodded. "Wife. Boy. Fever took, and while I was off fighting somebody else's war." Clara looked down, her fingers tightening around the tin cup. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," he said quietly. "The world don't owe us mercy, just chances to make things right." She looked up at him, and for the first time saw the man beneath the hardened eyes. Not a killer, not a hero, just someone trying to keep the ghost quiet. The peace didn't last. The first shot cracked through the dark, a clean, sharp echo that shattered the calm. Jonas dove, pulling Clara down behind a rock just as a bullet splintered the pine above them. "They found us," she gasped. He cursed under his breath, rolling to grab his rifle. Stay low. Muzzle flashes flared along the ridge. Brief bursts of orange against the black. Jonas returned fire. Once, twice. The reports booming across the canyon. A horse screamed in the distance. The attackers fell back briefly, then began to circle. Clara's breathing was ragged. She reached for his arm. Jonas, we can't outrun them this time. No, he said, but we can make them bleed for every inch they take. He handed her the revolver. Ever use one? She hesitated, then nodded. Once. Didn't miss. Good, he said. Then keep it that way. They fought through the night. Flashes of firelight. Shouts swallowed by the wind. By the time the gunfire faded, dawn was crawling over the horizon, painting the world in bruised gold. 2 riders lay dead below the ridge. The rest had fled. Jonas slumped against a rock, breathing hard. His arm was grazed, his face streaked with dust and blood. Clara knelt beside him, pressing a strip of cloth to his wound. You're bleeding, she whispered. He gave a weak laugh. Ain't the first time. For a moment, the world seemed still again. Just them, the fire dying low, and the first light of morning washing everything clean. By noon, they were back in the saddle, weary but alive. Dry Creek shimmered faintly ahead, a scatter of rooftops and dust in the distance. Salvation, or something pretending to be it. As they rode, Clara glanced at Jonas. When this is over, what will you do? He shrugged. Don't know. Maybe fix that old fence back at the ranch. Maybe plant something. She smiled faintly. And if you can't, then I'll keep riding, he said, till I find a place quiet enough to forget. Clara looked out across the plain, endless and golden beneath the sun. Maybe, she said softly. Forgetting isn't what we're meant for. Jonas didn't answer. But when he looked her way again, the faintest trace of peace crossed his eyes. By the time Jonas and Clara reached Dry Creek, dusk had bled into gold. The town looked the same as it always had. Weathered facades, hanging dust, that same tired wind pushing through the streets. But something felt different. The air carried a pulse now. Attention. Word had already spread. They rode in slow, both horses weary from the long push. Townsfolk stepped aside, whispering as Jonas passed. The gunman who'd vanished years ago, back again, carrying something heavier than bullets. They stopped in front of the courthouse. 2 deputies leaned against the steps, rifles in hand, badges dull under the fading light. Inside, Judge Mather's voice carried low and cold to the open window. Jonas dismounted, handed Clara the reins. You don't have to do this, she whispered. He looked at her, really looked. Yeah, I do. Inside, the courtroom was dim. Mather sat behind a bench, fat and smug, papers neatly stacked beside him. Well, he drawled, if it ain't the prodigal son of Pine Basin. I heard you've been keeping poor company. Jonas dropped the ledger onto the table. The sound cracked through the silence like a gunshot. Your name's in there, Mather, so are your payments. Every bribe, every murder you call justice. The judge's smile thinned. That ledger's fiction. Jonas cocked his head. Then you won't mind me hand over to the U.S. Marshal riding in from Carson tonight. For the first time, Mather's eyes flickered. He rose slowly, his hand edging toward the drawer. Jonas saw it coming. The revolver came out smooth. One shot. The judge's hand froze halfway to his pistol. Don't, Jonas said quietly. Mather hesitated, then sank back into his chair. You think you can walk out of here alive, Creed? Jonas smiled faintly. I don't need to. Just long enough to finish what she started. Outside, Clara stood with a growing crowd, townsfolk, ranch hands, even a few of the judge's former deputies. They watched through the windows as Jonas walked the ledger into the center of the room and laid it open for all to see. The paper spoke louder than bullets, names, signatures, blood money. The kind of proof no one could deny. When Jonas stepped back outside, the air had changed. The crowd parted for him. Some tipped their hats. Others just stared. Clara met him halfway. It's done. He nodded. One way or another. They left Dry Creek at sunset. The ledger, now in honest hands, would see to the rest. The judge would hang. The basin would breathe again. Jonas and Clara rode out along the ridge, the sun dipping low behind them, painting the world in gold and crimson. "You could stay," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "And do what?" "Live." He thought about it, really thought, then looked toward the horizon. Maybe someday. As they rode on, the wind carried their silhouettes across the plain. Two riders fading into the light, bound by loss, redemption, and something neither of them dared to name. The fire of Dry Creek died behind them, and for the first time in a long while, Jonas Creed didn't feel the ghost at his back, only the road ahead.